First Thursday Mystery. This is month 1 and we are going to be making floating square blocks. In your kit you will find 12 8-inch white on white pieces of fabric and 12 2.5-inch aqua pieces of fabric. You will be cutting these squares down. I do not cut them to the actual size for you because I don't care to be responsible for your accuracy. To spray starch all of your pieces before cutting them to size. I'm using Best Press, which is a spray starch alternative, but you could use spray starch or sizing. The reason for spraying them is that it makes your fabric more stable. This is especially true if you have pre-washed. It adds a little oomph back to your fabric. It also stabilizes when we cut on the bias, and it will help to avoid raveling. You're going to spritz the fabric with the spray sizing or starch or Best Press, and then press it dry. Pressing is an up and down motion, not a back and forth motion, because we don't want to stretch the pieces out of square. Repeat the spray starch or Best Press for all 24 pieces of fabric in your kit. Next, we're going to cut our fabric to size. Our white pieces are going to be cut down to 7.5 inches. I will show you 2 different methods. Rather than cutting these one piece at a time, stack them up. You can do 3 or 4 layers, no problem. The first method I'm going to show you is using a ruler. You will need a ruler that is at least as big as the block, so in this case it needs to be bigger than at least 7.5 inches or bigger. I have all my blocks stacked up, and I want to make sure that I have a margin all the way around, and then I'm going to center my ruler over the blocks, making sure that I have 7.5 inches within the boundary of those blocks, so when I go to trim on all 4 sides I have some margin. I'll cut one side and then one other side, and then rather than picking up my fabric and moving it with the stacks, I don't want them to shift, so I'll pick up the mat and rotate it instead. Now I'm going to use my ruler again, and this time I want to line up the 2 edges that I have already cut with the 7.5 inch mark on the ruler. And once that's lined up, then I go ahead and cut the remaining 2 sides, and I have my 7.5 inch squares. To show you a second method for cutting down your squares using your cutting mat. This time you don't have to have a ruler as big as a square. We're going to put this fabric on the mat and make sure that it is overlapping on the lines, as you can see, just slightly over. Then I want a ruler that's at least as long as the square, and I'm going to line it up with the marks on the mat. Cut first one side, and then again you don't want to pick up your stacks of fabric, so rotate the mat. Line the ruler up with the line on the second side and cut. And again we're going to rotate the mat, but this time we have a little bit of a problem because there aren't any 1/2 inch marks on our mat. So I want to make sure that I have 7 inches, because these are going to be 7.5 inches, so I want to find the line for the 7 inch mark. And then I'm going to line up the 1/2 inch mark on my ruler with that line for the 7 inches. So that lining the 1/2 inch mark up with that line adds a 1/2 inch to the 7. So I will cut it, and again rotate the mat. Line up the 1/2 inch mark with the line that would be 7 inches. Just double check. And once you are sure that you have the right number, then line up your ruler and cut off that last side, and again you have 7.5 inch blocks. This will work great for this method, for this block, because we will be trimming them down later. Now if I'm going for a super accurate block, I probably wouldn't use my mat to cut my squares. We also want to trim down the blue squares to 2 inches using either one of the methods I just showed you. So once you have them all trimmed down, you will have 12 7.5-inch squares and 12 2-inch squares. Now, I would have gone ahead and cut my white pieces before I moved my stack so that they didn't shift. We're actually going to cut a 2-inch strip right out of the middle of our white piece. And to do that, I'm going to line up the 1-inch mark on my ruler with opposite corners. So once I'm sure that I have that opposite corner lined up with the 1-inch mark, go ahead and cut a triangle off of one side. And then we're going to rotate the mat again so that we don't shift the piles. And technically the 1-inch mark really should line up on the corners again, but at this point I'm more concerned with making sure that I'm getting a 2-inch strip out. So I have the 2-inch mark lined up with the edge of the fabric and cut. You want to cut the 2-inch strip that we got from the middle in half. You could just fold it in half and cut, but instead I measured from the lower corner to the not the lowest corner, but the corner, and I got 8.5 inches, so half of that is 4 1/4. So I lined my 4 1/4 mark up with the two opposite corners and made sure that I had the line along the edge and cut it in half. Now I have all 5 pieces to make my block. The 2 triangles, the 2 pieces that look like houses, and the center square. First step is to sew the blue center square to one side of the house block, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. To do that, I'm going to put the pieces right sides together, matching the short edges, and then I will stitch a 1/4 inch seam. I will repeat that process on the opposite side as well. I want to point out that I did chain piece my pieces together. If you're unfamiliar with the term, that just means that I'm feeding in one piece right after another. So once the first one's through, then I put the second one through, and I did all the way down one side. So I do not clip the threads between. Once I'm all done, then I cut off the back one and brought it forward. I do want to point out that the white on white fabrics are all different prints. So if you want them to be the same in your block, you need to make sure that you are picking up the same one. I stacked them in order, so when I clipped off the one on the back, then I picked up the right white on white. Once you're all finished, we're going to clip all the threads in between. The reason you might want to chain piece is it is faster, and it also does save on thread. Now that we have our pieces all sewn together, it's time to press. When I say press, press is an up and down motion. The first thing I want to do is press my seam as sewn to set the seam. And I like to have the piece that I'm going to press toward on the top. So I can just flip it up, and that puts the seam toward the side I want to press to. In this case, it is the aqua. I do want to remind you, you have bias edges on the white on white pieces, so don't rub your iron back and forth. That may stretch it out a square. It's just an up and down motion, and I sometimes just sort of nudge that seam with the edge of the iron and then hold it to press it. So now we have pieces that look like a big band-aid. Now we're going to add the 2 triangles to the sides of the pieces. Again, if you want your white on white to all match, make sure you get the right one. It's not a good idea to just put it on the edge. We do need to center it on that strip. And to do that, I fold it in half, and you could put a pin in there if you like for your matching. A lot of times I will just fold it and pinch it, and that gives me a crease that I can see, and I'll just match the creases. So you want to fold both your triangles and your center strip and find the center. Then you will match the centers and sew them with right sides together, again with the 1/4 inch seam. So I'll pull those pins out and just put a pin in to hold it. Just a reminder, those edges are biased, so be careful as you're sewing that you're not stretching your fabric. I have now stitched the triangles to both sides of my center section. Again, I chain pieced. So cut apart your chain piecing, and then I want to press again toward the blue. So my first step is to press the seam as sewn. Again, it's an up and down motion. I'm pressing toward the blue, so the blue's on top, and I use my fingers to sort of press it up, and then I will use the edge of the iron to nudge. I don't want a tuck in there. And you can just hold the iron there to press it down, not so long that you burn the fabric. And then I'm going to flip it over and do exactly the same thing on the other side. Press the seam as sewn, and then the blue is on the top, so flip it over so the seam is going toward the blue, and press my seam. And it may look like I'm doing back and forth, but I'm really lifting the iron slightly when I move it. At this point, it doesn't hurt to give it another spritz with the best press to just hold the whole thing stable for when we're ready to start trimming it down to size. Now we're ready to trim our blocks down. We're going to trim them to 5.5 inches, and we want to center that blue square in the middle of the block. So to do that, half of 5.5 is 2 3/4. So we're going to line up the 2 3/4 mark on our ruler, and you do need it to be at least as big as your square at this point. So 2 3/4 both vertically and horizontally. So we're looking at the points on the blue square and lining up our 2 3/4 marks both vertically and horizontally. And once you are happy with your lineup, then we're going to go ahead and cut off 2 sides. Once that is done, rotate the square, and technically the 2 3/4 mark should be going through the points on our blue square again, but at this point I'm more concerned with making sure I have a 5.5 inch square. So I'm lining up my 5.5 inch mark with the 2 cut sides and checking my center as well. If it's off just a hair, nobody's going to notice that your blue squares aren't floating perfectly in the center of your block. So that is our finished block, and you want to go ahead and do that to all 12 blocks. And once that's done, you are finished with month 1 of the mystery.